Alrighty, everyone. We are straight up at 6 o'clock, and I want to welcome you all to Pioneer Painter, the life of Arizona impressionist Effie Anderson Smith. This is a program that's put on by the Arizona Historical Society in conjunction with the Douglas Historical Society, and we're absolutely thrilled that you're joining us this evening. A few housekeeping things here. First of all, I'm Shelley Correll. I'm with Membership and Outreach for the Historical Society, and joining me is my colleague, Robert Fleck, who's our Development Associate, and he's also a historian. He's going to be working that chat box and answering your questions on the back end. So feel free to, again, use that chat box. A couple reminders for you. That chat box, you can introduce yourself and ask questions. And we are a pretty big group tonight, so we're going to honor those bandwidth gods. And we ask you to, if you're not presenting, to keep your video off and to remain on mute for the duration of the program. Please note that this event will be recorded and it will be emailed to all of you who have registered. Finally, if you do enjoy this program, please consider becoming a member. Our members here at the Arizona Historical Society, they support programming such as these virtual programs we've been putting on all year. Here at the Arizona Historical Society, we are focused on one thing, and that is connecting people through the power of Arizona history. And that's what we're doing tonight with you folks here who've come to hear this program on Effie. So thank you for helping us live out our mission. The Arizona Historical Society is old. We've been around since 1864. We are actually the oldest historical organization in Arizona, and we are the only statewide historical organization. We have two flagship museums, the Arizona Heritage Center in Tempe and the Arizona History Museum in Tucson. In addition, we have two historic properties, the Pioneer Museum up in Flagstaff, and the Sanguinetti House and Gardens in Yuma. So I told you our mission is to connect people through the power of Arizona history. We do that through a couple different ways. We collect, preserve, and tell Arizona's past through our museum exhibitions, through our libraries and our archives, through historic sites, educational programs such as the one tonight, and our award-winning Journal of Arizona History. We hope that you stay connected with us. You can do that by signing up for our email list, following us on social media, can order our license plate, and all that can be done on our website, which is azhs.org. All right, now we're going to get to our main program. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. His name is Stephen Carlson, and he's representing the Douglas Historical Society this evening. Stephen is a curator of the E.A. Smith Archive, which collects, presents, and preserves the art and legacy of pioneer Arizona desert impressionist landscape painter Effie Anderson Smith. A former Arizonan, Stephen is a member of the Douglas Historical Society. He currently resides in Southern Arizona and has been a classical music radio producer for 45 years. So it is my pleasure to turn things over to Stephen.
Thank you, Shelley. And I am just about to share my screen here with everyone and get started and hope that this is working. Are you seeing the screen that you want to see now, folks? Hello, and thank you for joining me for this talk about Effie Anderson Smith, who came to the Arizona Territory as a young bride in 1895. These are two of her most iconic paintings. On the right, the Grand Canyon view. On the left, a view of yuccas from atop the Chiricahua Mountains here in southeast Arizona.
I'm not getting the picture.
What's that?
Can you, it shows that Stephen has started sharing, but we're not seeing that first slide.
Oh, okay. Let's see what I have done wrong. Okay. I do not know why this is not sharing. Okay. Let me go out of this. Let me go out of the presentation and then back in. Are you still hearing me?
We're hearing you fine, Stephen.
Okay. And I'm going to share screen. And it is not giving me everything I want to see here. So let me go back into from the beginning. And are we presenting yet?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
Robert, I just want to make sure that you are allowing Stephen to share his screen.
Yeah. I'm seeing the screen now.
You are?
Yeah, we're good to go.
All right. So let me see if I can get me doing this again. Resume slideshow is what I'm asking it to tell me. All right. I am still not seeing the view that I want to see here, but I will go ahead and hopefully this is still working for you. You're still seeing the screen? Okay.
We're still seeing that first slide.
All right. Very good. So as I was saying, and thanks for bearing with me, folks, the paintings on the left have always been on our family. The one on the left with the yucca is coming down to me from Effie's son, my great uncle, who is named Lewis Anderson Smith. And when I also inherited the artist's papers and personal effects about 12 years ago, I slowly realized there was a story here, one that I could not easily find documented. And so I began searching for as many paintings and tidbits as I could find to fill in the many gaps in the narrative of my aunt. I'll share some of that with you tonight. We can only scratch the surface, of course, in the life of someone who lived 85 years, but we'll tell you more about Effie here in a moment. Are you seeing the Douglas Historical Society now?
Yep,
Yes.
that advanced
Yep.
perfectly.
Very good. Okay, then we should be good. I'm speaking to you from the Douglas Historical Society tonight, the Douglas Williams House Museum, where we collect, preserve, and exhibit cultural and industrial items related to the history of Douglas from its earliest settlement to the present time. Among the displays here is the only public permanent exhibit anywhere of paintings by Effie Anderson Smith, who we believe is Arizona's earliest impressionist landscape artist, known in her lifetime in Arizona as Mrs. A.Y. Smith. And Effie, as I call her, made Douglas her home during the 1940s, which turned out to be her most prolific years as an artist. Here at the Douglas Williams House, you'll see some historic room interiors, both from the Douglas and Williams families, who owned and occupied this house for over a period of 80 years. As Douglas was an important smelter town, the museum has an amazing range of artifacts and memorabilia related to mining and smelting, which were among the main economic engines of this region for most of the 20th century. A fabulous camera collection is housed in several display cases. The Mardi Desk photography collection, named for the two women who operated a camera shop and photography studio here in Douglas. And there's a display of beautifully restored antique firefighting equipment, including this 1916 Seagrave from the early days of Douglas, all on permanent display along with other exhibits on Douglas and Cochise County, which change seasonally. The Douglas Williams House, built in 1909, is named for the Douglas family. Dr. James Douglas is well known. He is largely responsible for the development of copper mining in Arizona. Ben F. Williams bought the house in 1943. He was a cattleman, a miner, and inventor, served as Douglas mayor, as did his son, attorney Ben Williams, Jr., who eventually sold the house to the state of Arizona. Desert Impressionist landscape painter Effie Anderson Smith had been coming to Douglas since its early days for church and social activities, as it became the easiest large town to reach by train or auto from her home at the small mining camp of Pearce, north of here. 80 years ago, in 1941, Effie wrote to a friend saying how pleased she was with the growing number of art students she had in Douglas. This photo shows one such group. These are probably wives of cadets at the Douglas Army Airfield at the time. Effie had lived mostly alone in Pearce as a widow for 10 years after her husband, Commonwealth Mine President Andrew Young Smith, died in 1931. She stayed on in Pearce through the Great Depression as the population dwindled from nearly 2,000 in the 1920s down to just 30, prompting the railroad to pull up the tracks in 1933. Then in December 1941, as news of the Pearl Harbor attack came, the 72-year-old Mrs. Smith had a choice to make. Could she move to Douglas to be closer to friends, to be near her art students, and set up her own independent art studio at the Hotel Gadsden? Perhaps she could sell smaller versions of her most popular desert paintings to the many travelers and soldiers coming through Douglas by train as souvenirs of their time in Arizona. She could also support the troops and war effort in Douglas in a bigger way than possible in tiny Pearce. It meant leaving her beloved home of 45 years, but she decided to take the leap. And by 1942, the Douglas Dispatch said Effie would be exhibiting soon and had decided to make Douglas her new home. Effie had been painting since she was a girl in Arkansas, and as we'll see, she progressed in her art while also excelling as a school teacher. But it was not until after she married and started a family that she would eventually embrace art as her true calling at the urging of others who saw something special in her abilities. Being a mother, a wife of a mining engineer, building a life in a mining camp, and taking leadership roles in her community at Pearce absorbed much of her time. But over time, Effie's art was gaining recognition along with her compelling personal story. She was profiled in this 1929 article, which captures many of her successes and struggles, including the fact that her home in Pearce had recently burned, taking with it many of the paintings she had planned to display in her coming Eastern exhibits, and also might add most of her early works that she had kept. Rebuilding a home destroyed by fire is one thing. Trying to recreate an exhibit of 20 paintings, 20 of your best paintings at that, at the same time is even more daunting. Still, the desert spoke to Effie. She adored it, and in good times or dark moments, she turned to her art for solace. Effie's mature canvases present vast, open vistas, interrupted only occasionally by the stray scrub or tree. For Effie and other desert painters of the early 20th century, the West came to exemplify both an imagined and observed vocabulary of what makes up the American frontier: geology, drama, isolation, and spiritual rejuvenation. Effie embraced the raw natural beauty and geology of Arizona's deserts, canyons, and mountains. And of the Sulphur Springs Valley, she said that it was an especially attractive place for the artist because of its aerial envelope, which she described as the layer of atmosphere immediately over the earth, and which is characterized by the conditions created by the earth. It's benefited in this way by the fact that there is little vegetation here due to the dearth of moisture, and so little in the way of gases rising from decaying vegetation. That, for Effie, made it the purest air in the world, and at the same time induced an atmospheric condition that is rich in potential for art, because it promotes excellent colors in every conceivable shade and hue according to the particular location and the lights and shades that fall upon it. Effie was convinced that the resulting abundance of sand and dust particles in our air act as tiny prisms, reflecting and reducing the light rays. She stated, "The painter weaves prismatic colors of the air into patterns of light and shade, and we call them pictures." Desert paintings like those of Effie Anderson Smith encourage us to allow our minds and spirit to roam the emptiness and search for meaning. These paintings permit us to engage with the power of pure natural creation in its starkest, sparest form, without the distractions of lush vegetation or the disruptions imposed by human intervention. All of these paintings are vistas Effie could easily get to, at least all the ones you've seen in the last few minutes, in the early days on horseback and eventually by car, within a few miles of her home in Pearce. But Effie did not limit herself to the Sulphur Springs Valley. By the late 1920s, she was most acclaimed for her impressions of the Grand Canyon. She traveled there several times to sketch and paint beginning about 1920, and the main viewpoints were where she did this painting, the main viewpoints and trailheads along the south rim of the canyon. Before we go further, I want to take us back in time to her origins long before Effie's love affair with Arizona and the West began in the 1890s. She started life and her artistic development in a very different place. This group of portrait photos begins on the left with one that was probably taken in Hope, Arkansas, around the time Effie turned 21 in 1890. She was born near Nashville, Arkansas in 1869 during the difficult years of Reconstruction after the Civil War, when the railroad started to build south of Little Rock after the Civil War down into Texas. Effie's father's business activities caused them to move to the newly established town of Hope, where Effie would grow up, attend high school, then college, and begin teaching school. It was there in and around Hope that she discovered her love of drawing and painting, passions that would later change her life. Effie's father and mother met and were married in Arkansas not long after he came from South Carolina. Adolphus Anderson had purchased about 1,600 acres of land in the months just before the Civil War began. Effie's mother, Adelia, was from a family of farmers and planters who had settled in southwest Arkansas as pioneers. Both of Effie's parents were well educated for their time. Major Anderson, as he was called after the war, had studied surveying and civil engineering in Virginia and entered politics in the 1870s and 80s in Arkansas in the reformist Greenback Party. Effie's mother appears to have had her own money and estate. As records indicate, she was taxed separately from her husband. Miss Effie, as she was probably known in her youth, came into the world at a time of economic and social instability. Though she lived the first 25 years of her life in Arkansas, when Effie began her new life in the New Mexico Territory as a school teacher in 1894, and later as a young bride in Arizona in 1895, she almost never spoke of her formative years that molded her character, her strong faith, and life goals. Here we have the earliest surviving painting by Effie, perhaps a study rather than an actual place, signed as she approached her 15th birthday. The feathery trees and shrubs, her attempt to capture a grand mountain landscape with other mountains in the distance, a pastoral scene with water, all reminiscent of the dramatic Hudson River style of American art that she probably had seen. The color palette she used in her later Arizona painting seems already established here, including the impressionist base color, violet. It was the French impressionist Edouard Manet who stated that the shadows were not actually black or gray, but violet, and critics at the time noted that many of the impressionist paintings proceeded from that color. As Effie was finishing high school in 1888 and attending Hope Female Institute the following 2 years, she seems to have become acquainted with William Mark Spencer. Willie was 2 years older and worked in sales and accounting for a prominent Hope retailer. As Effie turned 21 in September of 1890, romance blossomed, and Effie agreed to marry Willie on December 17th. We note that Effie was styling herself now as Effie Iola Anderson, Iola being the Greek variant of Viola or violet. But as fate would have it, Effie's Christmas wedding was followed by a springtime funeral. Willie died of tuberculosis on March 21st, 1891, a bit more than 3 months after their wedding, leaving the 21-year-old Mrs. Effie A. Spencer a widow. After Willie's death, Effie spent much of the summer with his family in Arkadelphia, living in the hotel they operated, and for 3 weeks dutifully visiting Willie's extended family in Tennessee, even though she was now his widow. That first summer as a widow, living with the Spencers in their hotel probably opened her eyes to some possibilities later in life. By fall, she was teaching, and over the next 2 years, she taught in the schools of Hope in Nashville. Another opportunity came for Effie to travel, though, out of Arkansas to see the wider world, first by attending one of the earliest teachers' conferences in the South, in Atlanta. But she somehow managed to expand that into a grand tour of America, so to speak, at least the Northeast, by train up the Eastern Seaboard and into the Northeast, with visits to Washington, Mount Vernon, Philadelphia, New York, and even as far as Niagara Falls. And we know from school records in Nashville that she gave a talk on George Washington's home in Mount Vernon the following spring. At the time Effie traveled to New York in 1892, the very first exhibits of French Impressionist paintings to be seen in America were on display, and for the first time, they were being embraced by the critics and public. In the 20 years since the painting on the left was completed in 1872 and rejected by the Academy in Paris, most academics and critics derided this new kind of art. When Impression Sunrise was first shown in Paris, the art establishment and critics were appalled and declared that this could not possibly be a finished painting. But then there are those now famous water lilies and the haystacks, which Monet painted repeatedly in different light, colors, and seasons. And Monet also explored the concept of nuance by painting the facade of the cathedral in the French city of Rouen many times. We need to keep in mind that the Impressionists forego realistic portrayals in favor of the fleeting impressions of the artist's surroundings, preferring to paint outdoors rather than in a studio, capturing the momentary and transient effects of sunlight by working quickly with greater awareness of light and color and the shifting patterns overall. The artist's emotional reaction to the subject influences the color palette, and that was certainly the case with Effie. Effie's cathedral was first and foremost in the Dragoon Mountains to the west of her house, Cochise stronghold, which she could see from the windows of her home in Pearce and went to many times. And by the 1930s, she'd already painted it at least 14 times, according to newspaper reports, and many more times after that. In Effie's case, often from slightly different vantage points. She took this approach with other subjects as well in southern Arizona as an outgrowth of her studies with Impressionist painters in California, most of whom were either from Europe or had studied with French Impressionists. Effie was teaching school in Arkansas into 1893 when several more major life events occurred to upend her world. First, her father died following a short illness in April. A few weeks later, in May, a devastating tornado ripped through southwest Arkansas and the town of Hope, leaving as many as half of the 10,000 residents of the region either homeless or destitute. And the financial panic of 1893 had begun, which precipitated a 5-year economic depression. The life of Effie, her mother, and her younger sister, Carrie, were going to suffer just when Effie's older brother appeared on the scene, George, who had gone to New Mexico around 1890 and established himself there. He returned to Arkansas just long enough to bring them all west to a new life. We know from the Deming newspapers that by the summer of 1894, Effie and her sister Carrie had resigned their teaching positions in the schools of Nashville and Hope, and were in Deming being introduced socially by their brother at various community and private gatherings. As a widow, Effie was now known as Mrs. Effie A. Spencer, and by the autumn of 1894, both Effie and her sister Carrie had secured teaching jobs in New Mexico. Effie's brother George was now working at the Deming train station, and one of his co-workers there was a young Scottish immigrant named Andrew Young Smith, serving as a clerk and telegrapher. Andrew, or AY as he became known, met in Deming as part of a social gathering, Effie and Andrew did, called the Once a Week Club. Soon he secured a new railroad job at a train station down the line at Benson, Arizona in 1895, working both for Southern Pacific and Arizona Southern. Before he left Deming for Benson, he asked Effie to join him in Arizona as his bride. Effie agreed, and on August 1st, 1895, Effie A. Spencer became Mrs. A.Y. Smith in a small but lively ceremony and celebration at the Bessemer Hotel in Bisbee. A.Y. Smith had been a stonecutter by training in Missouri and Northern California, a railroad clerk, and then, seeking advancement for himself and his new family, parlayed his skills as a stonecutter and railroad clerk into a job as bookkeeper at the Commonwealth Mine in Pearce. Once there, he became active in building up Pearce and neighboring communities, making a case for the new railroad to expand its line to Pearce and then on to Douglas. He served on the Highway Commission of Cochise County and, with encouragement from Governor Campbell, ran for state senate. On their arrival in Pearce, the Smiths moved into temporary quarters in the mining camp, which was quickly mushrooming as more and more people moved house and home over the Dragoon Mountains to Pearce from fading mine towns like Tombstone and elsewhere. A more permanent house was completed in 1897 for the Smiths, and as the size of the town grew, so did the mine, its riches, and its mill facilities. A.Y. here on the left has his camera around his neck. The photo of the Commonwealth Mine Mills shows it just as it was being expanded and electrified, a project which, unfortunately, did not go well, as an electrical short caused a fire, which destroyed most of the mill in 1910. This is the Smiths' first house in Pearce, owned by the mining company. That's Effie on her pet horse, Maggie, taking aim straight at us. She and her friend, Mrs. McKean, and their children are in the carriage in the center with my Uncle Lewis when he was a little boy on the back of one of those horses. The caption is "The Home Ranch." And on the porch is her son again, Lewis, at about age 5 with 2 friends. I know that's kind of small. Hope you can see it. In 1896, Effie and A.Y. welcomed their first son, but both he and Effie were frequently ill, according to the Tombstone epitaph. Taken from Pearce to Tombstone for treatment, which was the closest place at that time, the baby died there, less than 4 months old, and is buried in Tombstone Cemetery. The circumstances of the death of their first child caused the Smiths to want their second child to be born under better circumstances than a mining camp could offer. So Lewis was born in Los Angeles, probably at the home of one of the mine investors. But he grew up in the shadow of the Mine Hill in Pearce, graduated from Stanford University and the University of Arizona. He wrote his U of A master's thesis on the Commonwealth Mine, no doubt with a little help from Dad, and became a geologist with Phelps Dodge Corporation. As in most mining camps, there were frequently problems and need for continuing investment. There had been a fire in 1900 in Pearce, and again in 1904, there was a major cave in the down in the main shaft. The initial investors, Richard Penrose and John Brockman, who were active all over the region, had already reaped millions of silver and gold from the Commonwealth and were contemplating selling out. Count James de Portales represented a syndicate of European investors, and he was also an art connoisseur who recognized in the paintings he saw in the Smith home that Effie had real potential as an artist. And he urged A.Y. Smith to help Effie study with the impressionists in California to expand her technique. We don't think Effie immediately ramped up her art studies, as she was still very occupied with raising children, tending to home duties, and those activities expected of the wife of one of the town's leading citizens, as A.Y. Smith was now superintendent of the Commonwealth Mine and soon to become president. One day, the Smiths drove over to the town of Fairbank. Upon their return, though, in the evening, they were horrified to learn their infant baby, Annadelle, was ill. Within an hour of their arrival home, the baby was dead. This was the great sorrow that Effie talked about later in life that prompted her to return to her art in months and years to come for solace. This is Effie's early mature style as an artist from around this time. The painting is undated. She seems to have started adding dates to paintings consistently only in about 1925 and onward. This certainly is the darkest, most moody work we know of by Effie Anderson Smith. It's here at the Douglas Historical Society. It may be a rare reflection of her emotional state in the months and years immediately following the death of her daughter, Annabelle. A few years later, we see the fruit of Effie's artistic labor and renewed studies in art in California. 6 paintings can be seen behind her on the wall in the bookcase there. And this one is even a marine scene, which if you go to Laguna Beach, where she was studying at this time, you could probably walk right down to these rocks. This, to me, looks like Cochise Stronghold. I think it's unmistakable. Not sure where these other scenes are. This is her favorite author and her husband's favorite author, Charles Dickens. Looks like they had a nice library, too. A wider view of the interior of the Smith home in Pearce. This is what we refer to in our family as house number 2. We know there were 11 paintings on the walls all across here, and all were apparently lost when this house burned to the ground in 1929 due to a faulty oil-fired water heater. Effie's most influential female mentor was Anna Althea Hills, and Effie studied with her while her son, Louis, attended high school in Los Angeles. This was in the very early days of the Laguna Beach Art Colony, before the renowned Art Association was established by Hills and others. Hills came to Arizona to paint in years to come. We don't know if Effie had anything to do with that, but 2 main things are clear. Effie improved her impressionist technique and color sense under Hill's guidance, and emulated Hill's skills as a relentless self-promoter in the newspapers, as is evidenced by the more than 500 newspaper citations I've found of Effie in her active years as an artist in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Here are some examples of Anna Hill's work. Note the trees in the center. They might remind you a little bit of the trees by Monet that we saw earlier. And the gold leaves of these trees, maybe sycamores in the upper right, were a recurring element in Hill's paintings, also in Effie's, and even in some of Effie's students' paintings. A scene near Palm Springs on the left by Anna Hills, and on the right, from Arizona, Montezuma's Head, or sometimes Montezuma's Needle. These paintings sell for tens of thousands of dollars now. The Stickney School in Pasadena is where Effie galvanized her impressionist technique. Richard E. Miller taught the life class where you would paint human models. As we've seen no examples of Effie ever painting another person, not even a family member, we have to assume she didn't feel that it was her best work, and none of her paintings of that type have survived. Jean Mannheim, looks like it should be Jean Mannheim, but it was Americanized as Jean later, was equally famous for his portraits and landscapes. And here you see a couple of examples of his work, one of his Marines there, and then the portrait here is of Mannheim's favorite niece, Anna, entitled The Lady in White. There are 2 scenes Mannheim painted in the desert near Palm Springs. And after Effie had studied with Mannheim in 1915 and 16, he gave her some advice. He told her to go back to her Arizona desert and work out her problems there. We assume he meant her artistic problems, but in any event, Effie did exactly that. By 1917, she was back in Arizona full-time, painting more and more. As a founding member of the Sulphur Springs Valley Red Cross and its first president, Effie and her friends first went to work making bandages and small personal care kits for each of the local young men going off to boot camp and training as the U.S. entered World War I in Europe. This photo was probably taken at Cochise Stronghold in that beautiful grove of trees that local people were so fond of and are to this day. By 1918, though, these women were fighting a different battle, which would rage for over 2 years, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. We see Effie second from the right here in a special headscarf. As Effie's parents and grandparents were active in civic affairs, Effie followed their example, and A.Y. Smith seems to have encouraged her. With the train and automobile increasing mobility, her leadership roles were not just limited to her local community in Pearce, but throughout southern Arizona. In 1928, a fire broke out in Effie's favorite home away from home, the Hotel Gadsden in Douglas, and it was destroyed. Most of the hotel, that is, was destroyed. When it was rebuilt, new artworks were commissioned, and one of those was in the grand staircase. The architect for the rebuilding was Trost of El Paso, and they brought in an El Paso artist who had already painted extensively in Arizona to create this scene of a cattle drive near Cave Creek Canyon in the Chiricahua Mountains, not far from here in Douglas. The artist Audley Dean Nichols was responsible for that painting. He was widely admired for his depictions of the West and especially of Arizona. These are some examples, and for reasons that may be obvious, he is now considered to be the most prominent and accomplished of a group of artists in El Paso now known as the Purple Mountain Painters. Effie's frequent stays at the Gadsden before the fire and after may have brought her into contact with Nichols, or perhaps that occurred on one of Effie's frequent visits to El Paso, where she also exhibited on multiple occasions. And the possible influence of Audley Dean Nichols seems to have made an impact. There are some earlier paintings by Effie where she works to capture the rosy sky effect above purple mountains, but none so successful as the painting she created after Nichols was in Douglas. The two artists appear to have kept in touch because when Effie sold one of her Grand Canyon paintings, the Douglas Dispatch reported it had been sent to Nichols in El Paso for framing. And the article included a complimentary quote from Nichols praising Effie's skill in capturing the Grand Canyon consistently well. Speaking to the Tucson Women's Club in 1932, Effie spoke of the relation of sound to color. She'd been reading about the scientific findings of the German physicist Heinrich von Helmholtz, whose experiments in correlating sound and color were related to his study of ophthalmology. Intrigued, Effie said, just as in music, a composition is played in a particular key, so in painting, it is set to some particular color key. Harmony is essential in both arts. If, as is claimed, she said, every sound has its corresponding color wave, may we not dream of a bewildering color feast flung on canvas to the tones of a Wagner overture or a Beethoven sonata? What a fascinating problem it would be to work out the color probabilities of the great masterpieces of music. Effie did play the piano. She had a piano in her home, so did her mother, and between Wagner, Beethoven, and I guess Liszt was her other favorite composer. She's kind of tipping her hand here. I believe Beethoven, she said, of all the master musicians, would best have interpreted this desert land of ours. Being deaf, he dwelt in the vast silences and understood their vibrations. A few words about Effie's most acclaimed paintings, her Grand Canyon series of 1928 and 29. This is probably the prototype with dual dates. In one corner, it says 1928 and 1935 in the other corner, which is kind of odd, but it indicates a long period that she worked to perfect it. But as many artists are working on more than one painting simultaneously, it appears she worked on this and several others that are all in the same size format, 20 by 28, and we'll see a few of the others. Here is almost the same scene. I'll go back to the other one. You see the two temples, as they're called there. And here we see the two temples again, but the coloring's a little different. The shading is different, the sky, the lighting. She intended 3 of these paintings for her Eastern exhibits in 1931, and in later years, she would display 3 of those as a grouping she called her Grand Canyon Suite. I'm not sure if she knew about Bertie Groffet's musical work of that title, but this Grand Canyon painting is looking east from Yavapai Point, also from that same series in 1928. Not sure if that's the original frame, but it's a beautiful one. This is more like the original frames of that time for her. This one, we don't know where Lacey Point is, and I've asked guides at the canyon. They don't seem to know either. This might not be the name of a current lookout, or if it is, or it may have changed names. Also, there was a painting called The Unnamed Temple that we haven't actually seen yet, but since there's only one of those temples here, it's possible that that is this painting or similar. This was probably not in the exhibits in the East, but the other ones you saw were, and we'll see that in the program in a minute. The Smiths had to rebuild in 1930 after their longtime home caught fire and burned to the ground, taking many of the paintings that she was preparing for the exhibits in the East with her. This house is still standing today. You can go and see it anytime you're passing down Highway 191 between Wilcox and Douglas. Pearce is just off the road there, and this house with this gate, some of the configuration has changed a bit. The trees are gone, but these two pillars are still there. And this schoolhouse, of course, has been replaced by a very large gymnasium, as most of the people in the communities who have children send them there for elementary school. Here is Effie on the left with her friend Margaret Ray Tuttle. Ms. Tuttle's husband, Dr. Lynn Tuttle, was a physician in Douglas and also mayor of Douglas. Effie and Meg Tuttle, as she was called in the family, were very close. And this is A.Y. Smith here, all dressed up. And the house was pretty much designed by him, according to a letter that I found between Effie writing about it to Congresswoman Isabella Greenway, which we'll talk about in a minute. And these photos are courtesy of the family of George Monthan, who is a nephew of the Tuttles. Here they are again out front, and Effie with her dear friend. Looks like a 1928 Buick back there. That was the car that the Smiths had at that time. Here are some of the other people that Effie was close to over the years, and due to time, I can't go into this too much. Edith Stratton Kitt, a name known to historians, Arizona Pioneers Historical Society. She had contacted Effie about providing some stories of her early days in Arizona. Catherine Daniels Kitt, I don't believe these ladies were related by blood, but they both married the Kitt brothers. Involved in the early days of the art colony in Tucson, and Catherine Kitt established the art department at the University of Arizona about 1927. She and Effie went around to all the women's clubs in the late 1920s when Effie was art chairman of the Southern District of the women's clubs, and Catherine Kitt, I believe, was a high officer. Edith Choate Young, this lady was from Cortland, which is a town right next to Pearce, which was a big copper mining center, but it was pretty much closed down by 1920. Edith moved to Tucson. She got very actively involved in the Tucson Symphony, created the first non-church affiliated girls' school in Tucson, and in 1935, in the depths of the Depression, started a travel agency. And it allowed Effie and Edith to go to Mazatlan along with some other people at one time. Isabella Greenway, of course, I don't need to say too much about her, founded the Arizona Inn. And Effie was invited to exhibit there. A lot of hotels invited artists to come and exhibit as part of their being almost kind of a cultural center in the communities where these hotels were, because there weren't many art galleries. And of course, Isabella Greenway King became Arizona's first congresswoman. Effie campaigned for her, even though Effie had been on the Hoover reelection campaign. She decided, friendship's more important than anything else. I'm going to campaign for my friend. And so they were actively involved. And thanks to the Arizona Historical Society, 60 pages of letters between Isabella Greenway and Effie Anderson Smith are preserved in the files of the archives in Tucson. I was delighted to find those about a year ago. Elsie and Myram Tolles. Now, these women were well known to Effie, younger than her, but Myram studied with Effie painting. They were both authors and school teachers, wrote children's book, and Elsie is in the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame for being the first female superintendent of schools in Arizona. And it turned out she had been the unwitting flower girl at Effie's wedding in 1895 in Bisbee. I think the two of them only discovered that years later. And I won't say too much about Governor Campbell or Governor Moore, but the families of both of these governors have some of Effie's paintings. I'm still trying to track down the contacts there, but I know it was Governor Campbell who convinced A.Y. Smith to run for Senate in 1922. This is one of several historic programs and reviews that we have in the E.A. Smith archive. of Effie's activity as an artist, along with many newspaper articles. These are available to appraisers, dealers, and researchers for non-commercial use. If you are interested, I'll put up my contact information at the end of the presentation. Among the paintings Effie exhibited in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York in 1931 is one that Effie confessed she had a special affection for. She liked to show people her painting The Old Yucca, which she had seen when she first came to the valley almost 40 years before. The yucca, of course, not the painting. The same rugged sentinel of the desert as it was then. She said, "I feel a sense of ownership in that old yucca. The artist, you know, owns everything he paints, all the acres, all the scenery, everywhere, which he catches with his brush and transfers to the canvas. It's his, an uncontested title without taxes, unless he sells. To me, that is a beautiful situation." P.G. Beckett served as vice president of Phelps Dodge Corporation and general manager of the copper producers' Western operations in Douglas. In 1931, he knew that PD was merging with Calumet and Arizona Mining Company, and it operated the copper smelter in the background while PD's Copper Queen smelter in the foreground was scheduled for closure and dismantling. It's believed Mr. Beckett commissioned Effie to create this very unusual painting for her, a subject she wouldn't probably have gone after, depicting the Douglas smelters, which Effie completed in 1931. This painting became fairly damaged over the years, as some of Effie's paintings do. There's a lot of lead in the paint in the sky, and it tends to flake if it's not under the right conditions. So that was recently and beautifully restored, thanks to fundraising through the Douglas Historical Society, I might add. Mr. Beckett also commissioned Effie to paint a series of views of his country cottage north of Douglas, which he gifted to prominent families in and around Douglas, who he was close to. These are a few of the rare cases where Effie painted buildings. Effie's first major exhibits were in Tucson in the early 20s with the Tucson Fine Arts Association before they ever had a thought of having their own building. And it was there and here in Douglas, but especially Tucson in the 20s, where she had her first great successes, as with the Dragoons and the Chiricahua Mountains, which surround Effie's home of 45 years in the Sulphur Springs Valley. We know Effie painted the Catalinas several times. You will note in Effie's paintings, again, as before, there are no signs of human activity, no buildings, no figures on horseback, pretty much as the native peoples knew the place and as the pioneer settlers saw it for the first time. We have 15 paintings by Effie Anderson Smith in the E.A. Smith Archive collection. Some of them have been in the family always and come down. Others have been kindly donated by people that felt that these paintings should be together and available for loan to museums and historical societies, along with didactic narrative, storyboards, and photos. If your organization is interested, I'll have contact information on the screen at the end if you would like to have a talk or an exhibit. At the height of Effie's fame as an impressionist desert painter in the 1920s and 30s, with exhibits across Arizona in the women's clubs, the few galleries that would allow a woman to have a solo show, and at the more established art galleries and institutes from California to New York, Effie was most frequently displaying at hotels, which invited artists, and arrangements were made for both the artist and the hotel to profit by the sales. These are three of the places that she loved to go to: Hotel Paso del Norte in El Paso, the Santa Rita Hotel on the lower left, the Hotel Adams on the right in Phoenix, and above is the El Paso Hotel. And of course, El Tovar, just steps from the head of Bright Angel Trail and some of the locations where Effie painted on the south rim of the canyon. In addition to hotels, there were a few venues where women artists could display, aside from the women's clubs. Often these were art supply shops that had a separate room where paintings could be displayed. Some of them went to great lengths to bring in artists and create a season of rotating exhibits. In other cases, it was more of a consignment arrangement between the artist and shop owners. In the case of the Risdon House in Clifton, it was actually a photography studio that Effie had befriended the proprietor. Effie also displayed and sold paintings through Brem's gift shop here in Douglas. In the 1940s, Effie realized that she had missed an opportunity to make her yuccas and other desert cactus and plants the subject of her paintings. And she did that increasingly in the 40s in what she called her smaller suitcase or briefcase-sized works that were popular with tourists, soldiers' wives decorating their homes, and local people looking for something smaller but reminiscent or representative of the local area. And sometimes these were quite similar to her larger paintings from the 1930s. All right, we're kind of getting short on time here, so I'll wrap this up. She went through painting a number of these smaller paintings, and these are the ones that you find around pretty easily. Even sometimes they pop up in thrift stores these days. By 1947, she thought, it had been 20 or so years since she'd done a Grand Canyon painting. She would do one much larger one, and this is probably a little larger than even the others. I know I say 20 by 28 here, but when I examined it, it might be actually a little bigger than that. And she did another Grand Canyon painting smaller than this for somebody the following year, but that was pretty much the end of her painting of the Grand Canyon. But it was nice at age 78 to know she could still do it. As a lifelong teacher, be it a school teacher, Sunday school teacher, and private art mentor, she also founded a circle of artists, women's here, adult women artists in Douglas in the 1940s, many of whom went on to become quite prolific in their own right. As Effie's art blossomed later in life, she was always encouraging women to explore art, not just as a hobby, but as a means of self-expression, and even as a way to support themselves independently. In 1951, at age 82, Effie decided to take advantage of a benefit offered by the state of Arizona to its early pioneers, and she became a resident of the Arizona Pioneers Home in Prescott. She moved there right after Thanksgiving in 1951, and for a time, she continued to paint. This is the last known painting by Effie Anderson Smith. It looks quite a bit like other paintings I've seen by her, depicting scenes along the Coronado Trail near Morenci, a series she began in her 70s while on a seasonal visit to her son, Louis, who was an engineer for Phelps Dodge there, and who lived there with his wife, Norma. We know by 1953, the Douglas Dispatch was reporting that Effie was working in the Pioneers' home library, organizing books and records for the residents and seeking donations of those. But the article said Effie was no longer painting due to her eyesight. Effie passed away on April 21st, 1955 at the Arizona Pioneers home after a short illness at age 85. She is buried at Mountain View Cemetery. Note the birth date's incorrect. It was 1869, not 1868, but, well, these things happen. Over 68 years of her active life as an artist, she created a legacy of hundreds of paintings, which still have people talking and have brought us all together to remember her today. 1989, an exhibit was 40 years after her birth, her 80th birthday retrospective here in Douglas. There have been a couple of these anniversary exhibits. And in 2012, we had a statehood centennial exhibition here in Douglas. A digital copy of the exhibition catalog is available on the Effie Anderson Smith website. If you let me know, I can send it to you as a PDF. The Tucson Desert Art Museum honored Effie in 2019 with a 150th birthday retrospective. It was 75 years after Effie had exhibited in Tucson, and there is a page up with photos from that exhibit if you would like to see it. I want to thank you for watching, and both the Douglas Historical Society and the Arizona Historical Society, and for inviting me to present this talk. And special thanks to all the individuals and institutions who've helped me and continue to help me in researching the life and art of Effie Anderson Smith. I have a book-length biography coming out on Effie in 2022, I hope, in days to come. If any of you have questions, feel free to contact me here. And thanks for listening.
All right, Stephen, that was an absolute treat. Want to thank you for that presentation that spoke about the painter, a woman of passions, and certainly an Arizonan who left a legacy here. We've got time for some questions. We've already got one in the chat. This one is from Linda. Stephen, this is beautifully and sensitively researched. What more can you tell us about Effie's papers, personal correspondence, or diaries?
This has been a difficult part of finding her life because she didn't really leave much of a narrative. We don't know. According to people in the family, she was a very active letter writer, but very few have survived. Like most of us, you get a letter from some family member, you say, oh, that's nice, and then you toss it and don't think too much about it. And so if it weren't for the Arizona Historical Society with those letters that she had with Isabella Greenway, which were probably part of a legislative file at one point, because it was I didn't even know it was there. It was filed under constituents for Pearce, no name on it. But Rachel Black in Tucson found it for me and told me what was there. There have been a few other letters that have emerged from people that she knew. Douglas historian Cindy Hyostek, who's sitting over here with me, has a letter in her family that Effie wrote as a condolence letter to her grandmother, your grandmother, and at the death of her grandfather. And of course, the letter is very personal and familiar, filled with scripture verses as a Southern Methodist, Cumberland Presbyterian would have done, and later High Church Episcopal woman. And then there was just recently another letter that showed up in one of the families that was one of Effie's students here, adult students. But aside from those few letters, we don't have a lot. No diaries have survived. Maybe they will show up. You never know. You just never know.
All righty. Mary Hayes says, wonderful, thanks. Trenton Farah wants to know, when did Effie become a widow the second time?
Okay, so I didn't present this in chronological order. You'll be happy to know that on the effieandersonsmith.com website, there's a section called Bio, and it is chronological. But the second time she became a widow in 1931, that she went east for those exhibits, and it was a long train trip with her husband who accompanied her, A.Y. Smith. They went to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York, and came back through Pittsburgh. We're not sure if it was just because A.Y. Smith wanted to see all those big steel mills and all that big industrial activity, or was it a connection with somebody she knew? But they eventually got back, and this was in June. Reports were in the paper that they had a wonderful time and everything had happened. That fall, A.Y. Smith became ill, and he had a recurring kidney problem, and also it turned out a brain tumor, and he died in October of 1931. It was a big funeral in Cochise County, like the mining community, the ranching community, they all knew each other. And that was the second time she became a widow. So she outlived her second husband by decades.
All righty. So you've got Joan wants to say wonderful, wonderful. We'll keep this chat up, Stephen, so you can read it afterwards.
Sure.
Ruth is saying thanks for doing this. Art also, thanks for a wonderful presentation. Susan Anderson wants to know, where in Irvine, California is the E.A. Smith collection?
It's in my bedroom. It is not open to the public as far as a museum or an exhibit yet. Working on this. It all requires funding or a partner institution that wants to either host a part of it or is willing to partner to make it more of a physical reality so people can come in and see it. But I'll tell you what, if anyone contacts me and there's anything that I have that would be interesting or useful to you, I'm happy to share. Absolutely.
Excellent. Wynn Brown.
Wynn, yes.
Yeah, she says, it's a treat to hear more about Effie, and it seems as if you continue to find more of her work as the years go on. Could you talk a little more about that, about finding more of her work as the years go on?
Yes, and Wynn has a book out on Sarah Lemon, who was doing all of those wonderful botanical paintings and watercolors here in Arizona, earlier than Effie, by the way, and that's a must-have for anybody. But finding Effie's paintings has been interesting because usually people come out of the woodwork. I would say 4 or 5 times a year, I'll get an email either through my website or at one time, when I started this 12 years ago, there's a website called Ask Art, which was created here by Arizona people, and it is the site of record for all kinds of listed artists. Almost any artist in the world is on there. And I just put a little posting next to Effie who had been put on there by somebody else, and people would start contacting me. Paintings have come out of the woodwork that way. And it's usually somebody who had their ancestor, someone back 2 or 3 generations in their family, knew Effie, or decided to buy a painting from her because they just wanted something in their home that looked like Arizona rather than all the other things you could buy from other places. So these have just kind of shown up that way. Some people have, written to me, telling me that they knew somebody that had one. As a matter of fact, Governor Moore's, someone in that family told me, Flo has one and you better get in touch with her. And so I find out these things sideways, sometimes direct. Sometimes somebody will just come up at an exhibit and say they know that somebody might have one. Recently, it's 2 years ago, someone who came to an exhibit at the Tucson Desert Art Museum exhibit was involved in political activities in Casa Grande and was going to the old women's clubhouse there where they have meetings. And she saw this painting up on the wall, and she knew her cousin had one of Effie's paintings. She said, that really looks like an Effie Smith painting. They got it down, and sure enough, it was in okay shape. So we've since documented that, had it cleaned, and it's out and in view again. Yeah.
And we're going to just wrap up with one final question here. Linda Craven says she's very much interested in the digital exhibition catalogs. Again, where can folks find that?
EffieAndersonSmith.com is a website, .com or .org. And if you go to the sidebar on the right side of the homepage, you will see a strip, and down there it will say the exhibition catalog from the Douglas exhibit in 2012. If you just send me an email at the Effie Anderson Smith website and tell me that's what you want, I will send it to you. In the email, it'll be a PDF.
Excellent. Well, Stephen, on behalf of the Arizona Historical Society, we're grateful that you joined us this evening and just shared a fascinating story. And our thanks also to the Douglas Historical Society, who is one of our certified historical institutions. So with that, everyone, thanks for being here and take care.
Thank you. Good night.